Gettysburg. What visions of those free summer days of July 1863 the magic word recalls. Although nearly a half century has rolled away since the last shots were fired on the field, yet to the veteran it seems but yesterday. To him, the smoke of the guns still lingers in the valleys. The sound of the conflict, the roar of the artillery, still echoes and reverberates among the fir-dew-clad hills. The 116th have good reason to rejoice that their regiment had the happiness of participating in this, the most important battle of the century, and performing an honorable and distinguished part therein. Hello guys, welcome back to a new edition of Retracing History. We're back on the Gettysburg battlefield. It is a beautiful day here in June of 2024. And we're about to walk in the footsteps of one of the most famous units to fight in the American Civil War, the Irish Brigade of the Union Army, who would have been encamped on the morning of July 2nd, just over my shoulder here on Cemetery Ridge. Now, there's tales of heroic sacrifice made at the Bloody Lane at Antietam and at Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg are well known in the general history of the American Civil War. And while people know that the Irish Brigade were here at Gettysburg, I must be honest, I did not often hear people talk in detail about what the Irish Brigade actually do here, minus a very moving religious service that is hosted on Cemetery Ridge. We're going to talk about that moving service, and we're going to talk about the actual fighting the Irish Brigade will be involved with. And what you're going to discover, by 1863, the story of the Irish Brigade is not a story about Irish pride or Irish heritage, though it is today. In 1863, the Irish Brigade was in a fight for survival. The Irish Brigade are one of the most famous units from the American Civil War, but I want to catch you up to pace on what the Irish Brigade's up to in June and July of 1863. The brigade was founded in 1861 by Thomas Francis Marr. Marr was an Irish rebel in exile who was living in New York City, and he wanted to gain support for maybe one day going back to Ireland with an armed force and liberate Ireland from the grip of the British Empire. Well, he feels the solution for that is through raising a Union unit to fight in the American Civil War. This will win admiration and support from the American people for the Irish cause of independence. And you have to remember, at this time in the 1860s, the Irish are, in the eyes of many people in the United States of America, lesser than human. That's the simple way I can put it. There's signs all throughout cities that Irish need not apply. People are not wanting to hire the Irish. They are considered the lowest rung of society, especially in the northern cities. So Marr wants to change that. He feels that he can win, if he can get the United States to support the Irish cause for independence, that it'll probably be successful, that he needs the United States to do so. In any case, that's going to be his motivation for raising this Irish Brigade. It's initially going to be made up of the 69th New York, which actually was a militia that goes back to the 1840s in New York City. It'll also include the 63rd and 88th New York, and it's going to include the 29th Massachusetts, who were not actually an Irish ethnic regiment. They were predominantly made up of Protestants, but, well, there's a reason to it. Initially, the 28th Massachusetts was going to be raised of ethnic Irish and going to be included in this Irish Brigade. There was a problem in recruiting that regiment. Recruiting officers began competing with each other, and no ground was being gained in creating the regiment. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had to step in, basically tell them, okay, this is how it's going to be. We're going to handle the recruiting. We can't trust you guys. Formed the 28th Massachusetts and immediately sent them off to South Carolina. And by the time Marr is forming the Irish Brigade, he can't get that ethnic Irish regiment he was promised, but Commonwealth of Massachusetts offers him the 29th, and beggars can't be choosers. This variant of the Irish Brigade will serve during the Peninsula Campaign, and when the Irish Brigade goes into action, they have, I've seen people say almost 3,000 people are in the brigade. I don't know if it ever reached that number. I don't know if that's combined service over the years. Normally I hear more about 1,500 men being in the brigade. In any case, they're going to serve in the Peninsula Campaign, and they're going to really get their first bit of fame at the Battle of Antietam, when they're sent to assault the sunken road in the Confederate center of their line. They lose 500 men in that fight, killed, wounded, or captured. In the aftermath of Antietam, Marr was very excited about what he felt that his men had proven themselves in battle, and he is actually going to give the 28th Massachusetts one of their very own Emerald Brigade flags to show that they are honorary Irish. The 29th Massachusetts do not accept the gift, which was highly controversial. The officers of 29th Massachusetts felt if they took the Emerald flag, they would be associated with Irish rebels, and they did not want to be associated with rebels of the rival faith in Christianity. Not working out in the United States in the 1860s. In frustration, the 29th are going to be sent to the 9th Corps, and in their place will finally come the 28th Massachusetts. That regiment initially raised to be with Marr's brigade. And in addition, you're also going to get reinforcements from the 116th Pennsylvania, and these 5 regiments are going to take part in the Battle of Fredericksburg, probably the most infamous action the Irish Brigade is involved with. They go in with about 1,200 men. They lose half of that number on December 13th, 1862. In the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg, many Irish people living in the United States of America were starting to get demoralized, as were many people in the northern cities. They did not see what's the purpose of this war. They're hearing these stories of great sacrifice and destruction, of vain sacrifices that are not gaining any ground, not for Irish independence, not for Irish acceptance in North America, and not for the Union coming back to be whole. So there's a lot of animosity building up in northern cities for the Union cause of this war. Marr is going to try to recruit reinforcements, but he keeps getting denied his request to go back to New York City and recruit for reinforcements. Now, he claims it's a conspiracy of the federal government against the Irish. I think it has more to do with the fact that the state of New York did not want to send soldiers into existing regiments. The state of New York seemed more interested in just creating brand new regiments with new officer corps and send them off. It was cheaper, well, more efficient to manufacture, I'd just say, manufacture a regiment like that. And I hate to boil it down like that into industrial terms, but that's the war machine for you. So by May of 1863, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, where the Irish Brigade suffer another 100 casualties, Marr is frustrated. He resigns his command of the brigade and effectively tells everybody in his farewell address that the Irish Brigade is no more. Marr gets to go home to New York City. The Irish Brigade must continue the war. And there are only about 500 of them when the Union Army of the Potomac is pursuing the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, culminating with the Battle of Gettysburg. Only about 500 men were still flying the Emerald flags of the Irish Brigade when they're going to arrive near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, under cover of darkness on July 1st, 1863. They're going to be coming up the Taneytown Road, which is behind me, and they're actually going to bivouac on the eastern side of Little Round Top, which is approximately over my shoulder down over the road here. On the early morning of July 2nd, they're going to be ordered to move into the battle lines of the 2nd Corps, which they're attached to in the Union Army, and they're going to come up on top here of Cemetery Ridge. Now, traditionally, a brigade in the American Civil War, you would expect to have minimum at least 1,000 soldiers, if not, up to about 3,000 troops. So keep that in mind. The whole brigade of the Irish is 500 men here. There are regiments that are fielded here at Gettysburg that are larger than the Irish Brigade itself. So they don't take up a lot of space, is what I'm trying to say. So they're in a particularly small patch of ground on top of Cemetery Ridge, filling out the battle line. And that's actually where we're going to walk down right now. We're walking down along Cemetery Ridge. We're walking along the battle line of all of the 2nd Corps. And somewhere along this stretch of road, well, now today a road. It was not a road here in 1717. Sorry guys, I'm doing a video on Fort Necessity and the French and Indian War. If it's already out already, I hope you watch it. If not, go see it when it comes out. So timelines get confused. So the road was on there in 1863. It's now there for the convenience of visitors to come to Gettysburg. The battle line is actually going to follow more closely to the monuments, which are in a rough line going down Cemetery Ridge. The commanders of the Irish Brigade in July of 1863, it's now under the overall command of a Colonel Patrick Kelly. Kelly was the colonel of the 88th New York, but when Marr resigns his command, Kelly is going to assume position, and Kelly's not, it's not a position he's not familiar with. He'd already effectively been in charge brigade for a few other times when Marr was on leave to try to recruit or was wounded. So Kelly is described by his men as being a very grave individual, speaks little words, but after every battle would grieve like a father for everybody that died, not just in the 88th New York, but the whole of the Irish Brigade. Under Kelly's command, you're going to have those free New York regiments, which by this point have been consolidated into a New York battalion, because there's only 70 men approximately per New York regiment. They're only in 2 companies in each regiment. So they're consolidated into a battalion for simplicity's sake, and according to at least one battle report I read, appears they're under the overall command of Richard Bentley, aka, yes, we can say R.C. Bentley. And man, he did not realize his name was going to be really funny years later. Radio-controlled Bentley. Very interesting. So R.C. Bentley is in charge of the New York regiments here. And then you're going to have the 116th Pennsylvania under a Major Mulholland. Mulholland had immigrated from Ireland, moved into Philadelphia, and well, he was quite the charismatic leader. His colorful regimental history of the 116th speaks for itself. And you're going to round this all out with the 28th Massachusetts. And the 28th Massachusetts, oh look, we've paused right here at the 2nd Corps, 1st Division, which the Irish Brigade is a part of. So we can keep talking now. The 28th Massachusetts, they joined the Irish Brigade after Antietam to replace the 29th Massachusetts. And they're in the charge of Colonel Richard Burns, and it's B-Y-R-N-E-S. Humble Collector suggested I pronounce it as Burns, so we're going to go with that.
I think it's Burns.
So if you think I'm wrong, you can't burn me. You got to go burn him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm just pushing that off you. Yeah. Look, I get so much slack for mispronouncing things, you know. I got to share in the mutually assured destruction, right?
Fair enough. Yeah.
Fair enough. So, Richard Burns is actually a regular U.S. officer. He'd been in the military prior to the American Civil War, and his men don't initially like when he's transferred over to the 28th Massachusetts. He's sent there to kind of put some discipline in the regiment. The first couple regimental commanders, they didn't really care too much about the discipline, kind of left the 28th to their own devices. Well, he is going to drill these men like a regular unit. He wants to get them as much experience as possible, much discipline. They initially hate him for the raw treatment, but they'll come to respect him by 1863, especially by this point when the Irish Brigade are, in terms of numbers, a shell of their former self. But don't let that discourage you on their passion, on their endurance to go into battle. They are still one of the toughest units for the Union Army of the Potomac here at Gettysburg. And that's kind of the Irish Brigade as it appears here, forming on Cemetery Ridge on the early morning, July 2nd, 1863. Patrick Kelly's in charge. The New York regiments are consolidated into a battalion under Bentley. You're going to have the 28th Massachusetts under Burns. See, I was trying to say Barnes. And you're going to round it all out with the 116th with Mulholland. As the tension builds amongst the Irish Brigade, as well as throughout the entire Union battle line, anticipating something's going to happen on July 2nd, a gentleman's going to approach Colonel Kelly and request to finally do some belated religious services. Since during the whole march, no religious services have been hosted amongst the Irish Brigade or any of the other units for that matter. They just have not had time as they're moving rapidly through Virginia, Maryland, and up into Pennsylvania to block the Confederates from threatening Washington, D.C. That gentleman that approached Colonel Kelly was this gentleman right here. Okay, not literally here. He's not encased. His remains are not encased in that bronze.
They're pretty metal, though.
That would be pretty metal, but this is, yeah, metal. Many layers to that joke. Yes.
That's right.
Yes. This is a statue depicting Father William Corby. Corby was a chaplain for the 88th New York. However, by the time the Irish Brigade had gotten to Gettysburg, Corby was the only chaplain present amongst the entire brigade. And a little bit of background on William Corby. He comes from Irish-Canadian ancestry, though he's actually born here in the United States in Michigan. And he is going to go to a relatively obscure college in the 1850s known as Notre Dame. Yes, we all know what Notre Dame is today, but in the 1850s, the college was only about 10 years old. It didn't have a really large student body. And he is actually going to be, he's going to go through the college, going to be educated in the Catholic faith, and then he is going to end up becoming, taking his vows at Notre Dame to be a Holy Cross Father. In the late 1850s, he also takes a professorship in the Manual School of Labor at Notre Dame. When the American Civil War begins, Corby is going to assign to resign his professorship to pursue a chaplain, to be a chaplain amongst the Union Army. And being of the Catholic faith, he is going to find his way with the Irish Brigade. Now, the Irish Brigade had, as I mentioned, several other chaplains earlier in the war, but the other chaplains were absent during the Gettysburg campaign, meaning that Corby was really the only religious shoulder that these troops could lean upon in very dark times for the brigade. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, Marr had, for all intents and purposes, had abandoned the brigade by this point. I told them the brigade is no longer the Irish Brigade, that the federal government's conspiring against them to not want to send reinforcements to them. They're kind of on their own in this fight for survival, so Corby has a very important position to try to keep the morale of the brigade together in these dark times. And since they've been deprived of any religious service for several weeks now, Corby is going to approach Kelly, ask, hey, we have a few hours to rest on our arms here. Can I do some type of service, just brief? Kelly's more than happy to grant it. And what is going to happen is Corby feels he does not have enough time to personally go around and give service to each man. So he's going to call the whole brigade together. He's going to stand upon a rock similar to this, and he's going to give the general absolution to the entirety of the brigade. Now, there is dispute over where it occurs and at what time of the day. If you ask Mulholland, who gives the most famous account of this general absolution, it's going to happen in the afternoon as Longstreet's attack is beginning on the Union left flank, and he claims that Corby's doing this under gunfire. He's doing this under the fire of battle. So it's this very harrowing image that Mulholland's going to create. There are other accounts of the general absolution occurring, and what is going to happen is the other accounts, particularly from other units that are looking on, they don't say it occurs in the afternoon. They say it occurs in the morning. And that would make sense because most of the accounts of the general absolution say it's not just the Irish Brigade listening in, it's also General Winfield Scott Hancock, the commander of the 2nd Corps, who is not Catholic, but nevertheless is actually going to go approach, take off his hat, and respect the general absolution that's occurring. And the general absolution of falls is so moving that Corby claims later on that at least one Protestant in the ranks of another regiment is actually come up to him and start asking him about the Catholic belief, and he'll actually convert it to Catholicism as a result of this general absolution. So whatever happened on July 2nd, which I personally do believe the general absolutions in the morning, was one of the most moving experiences of not just the Battle of Gettysburg, but for the entire Union Army during the Civil War. And later on, when Corby writes his memoirs, he is going to state that the general absolution was not just intended for the Irishmen, but is intended for everybody on both fields of the battle, so that they were given some sort of peace before they go meet their judge, because Corby knew that in a matter of hours, everybody would be committed into a great battle. I also want to mention about the service of chaplains during the American Civil War. Traditionally, chaplains were of older age, people that could not go into combat, so they try to do what they can to support the Union morale. And they do not last too long on the campaign, usually no more than 18 months. Their service is usually over. The Union Army, in terms of how they would supply chaplains, was a very gray zone. Typically, chaplains will be dressed in an all-black frock coat, complete with black buttons. Everything's all black. They could put a stole over or other religious iconography that was needed over the black frock coat. Sometimes they would have an aide to assist them in their duties. Then the chaplains were actually considered officers amongst the regiments. However, outside from that, things are pretty gray. The Union Army really didn't know what to do with the chaplains. So a lot of the personal effects, a lot of the supply-in, a lot of the things that the chaplain needed for their duties, a lot of that was up to the chaplain themselves. And trying to bring all that on a campaign was taxing, especially for older individuals during the American Civil War. That's where Corby is very different. He's only in his early 30s when he is the chaplain of the 88th New York. He stays with the Irish Brigade for 3 years during the American Civil War, and by the end the war is generally recognized as the de facto the religious leader for this entire unit in combat. And after the American Civil War, Father Corby is going to go back to Notre Dame, serve 2 terms as its president, and it's really under Corby's administration that Notre Dame is going to greatly expand and become the university that we know today, world famous. In later years, Father Corby will be brought upon for a lot of anniversary events, not just here at Gettysburg, but other battlefields. He's going to be at the dedication of the New York Irish Brigade Monument here in 1888. And the men of the Irish Brigade actually wanted Corby to be awarded the Medal of Honor for his general absolution and just for all of his services during the American Civil War. However, the United States government reminded the Irish Brigade that civilians could not be awarded a Medal of Honor. So the veterans decided a monument would be a good replacement for the Medal of Honor. And this was dedicated in 1910, and it is the first monument on the Gettysburg battlefield dedicated to a civilian. Now, movement is going to begin happening on the Gettysburg battlefield, but not in the way that the Union 2nd Corps is expecting. As men of the Union 2nd Corps, including the Irish Brigade, are going to look to their left flank, they're going to notice that the Union 3rd Corps, under the command of Dan the Man Sickles, is moving his entire corps about a mile forward to deploy on what he perceives as higher ground that he wants to secure for the Union Army. He's going to center his new battle line. His apex of the line will be at the Peach Orchard, the right flank coming up the Emmitsburg Road, while the left flank kind of descends down into a rocky region at the foot of Little Round Top. This is a problem because instead of now having a straight line, you got a giant salient in the left flank of your battle line, which is a very tempting target for the Confederates. At the same time Sickles was doing this, unbeknownst to him, the Confederate Army were already on the move to try to outflank the Union on the left. James Longstreet's Confederate Corps have made a countermarch going up Seminary Ridge or going back down, and now they are set into position south of the Union left flank and are begin to attack in echelon, which means they're coming in one brigade after another, starting on the very right and then moving their way up the left, which means as soon as one Confederate brigade engages the enemy, the Union are going to send all of their reinforcements to that one spot, which means the next spot to the right is a little bit weak, being smashed by a fresh Confederate brigade. And that is what's going to happen all throughout the evening on July 2nd, 1863. These echelon attacks of Longstreet's Confederate Corps starting from the Little Round Top, and as the evening progresses, moving closer and closer to Cemetery Ridge. This is going to force several Union Corps, including the Union 2nd and 5th Corps, to divert their troops from Cemetery Ridge to plug the gap created in Sickles' 3rd Corps line. Yes, I'm resting there in the shade of a green emerald leaves of a tree to talk about this next segment. And we're looking east along the Wheatfield Road. In this general direction is where Plum Run is. And it's somewhere around here roughly that the Irish Brigade are going to come into position to assault the Wheatfield. And as they make their way out into the Wheatfield Road, well, they're going to be greeted with quite the chaotic sight. So happening out here in the Wheatfield, what has already happened, the Irish Brigade are going to see dead and wounded from Trobion's brigade of the 3rd Corps, who were the first Union troops sent into the Wheatfield and began this fighting here. Well, they've been driven out by Confederate forces. The Trobion was reinforced by 2 brigades of the 5th Corps, Schweitzer and Tilton, and well, they got mauled up pretty badly on the far side of the Wheatfield. And the 2nd Corps, the 1st Division, John Caldwell, their job is to not necessarily reinforce Schweitzer and Tilton, it's to replace them. And you'll notice right out there on top of this brow, you'll see a couple monuments out here. Roughly out on this brow, you would have saw artillery of Winslow's battery, the last vestiges of the 3rd Corps holding Sickles' line for the Wheatfield. Well, as the Irish Brigade are starting to form up here in the Wheatfield Road, those guns are being loaded up and being hauled out of here because there is nothing protecting those batteries from being overrun by Confederate forces. So the Irish Brigade are really going to have to go in it with nothing in front of them to support. Off to their left, Cross's brigade of the 2nd Corps have engaged parts of Benning's brigade who have come up, Confederate forces have come up from Devil's Den, so they're fighting out woods, and Cross will actually be killed in that action. And on the Irish Brigade's right, you would have had Zulk's brigade trying to form up and trying to assault Stony Hill, which is going to be held by the 7th and 3rd South Carolina regiments. So right along the Wheatfield Road, we have an obelisk here that is in the memory of Samuel Zulk, who was he eventually be brevet and major general in the U.S. Volunteers. He was the brigade commander of one of the 4 2nd Corps brigades that'll come and reinforce the Wheatfield. And Zook actually, when he is approaching, coming down to the Wheatfield, he's pulled off by an aide from the 3rd Corps and directed to assist the 3rd Corps a little bit further out of the way from the Wheatfield. And so Zook's brigade, they're pulled away from the line of approach by the 2nd Corps. They come up here, and before they're even properly engaged, a bullet actually hits Zook and will mortally wound him in this general vicinity. And there's a brief lull where Zook's brigade are quite uncertain what to do. They're away from their 2nd Corps. They've been guided up here by a 3rd Corps aide they don't really know much about. They don't know the terrain too well. They've kind of been thrown into this chaotic situation. But they will renew the offensive and attack Stony Hill in sync with the Irish Brigade. So it's not just Kelly assaulting Stony Hill, though that's our main focus in this video. Also keep in mind Zook's brigade are assaulting Stony Hill on this portion of the battlefield. Now, for the Irish Brigade to deploy to face the enemy, they got a bit of a problem. According to interpretations by multiple historians, when the brigade arrives here, they're still in column of regiments. What that meant was when they went down here to attack, they had merely turned to their left on Cemetery Ridge and then walked to the south to the sound of the guns. And when they're ordered to front, well, there's a problem. They are still facing toward the north. Their backs are to the actual fighting. And this is further awkward because it means that you have your battle flags and you're going to have your officers on the wrong location of the line for attack. So there is apparently a moment here where the Irish Brigade have to try to do an about face. The linemen have to do an about face. Then the officers have to shove themselves through the ranks into their proper positions, and the color guard have to shove themselves forward to lead the regiments into attack. So there is a delay here, and this is all happening under the sound of gunfire and artillery detonating all around us. So quite a harrowing experience for this very small brigade, as basically the Union line is collapsing all around them. The Irish Brigade is going to deploy into the Wheatfield with the following. On their right flank, you're going to have the 116th Pennsylvania. On their left flank, you're going to have the New York Battalion. And then coming right at us here in their center would have been the 28th Massachusetts. You would have saw a myriad of battle flags, very interesting battle flags there adoring the Irish Brigade. Now, the Irish Brigade is pretty famous of having the emerald green brigade banner instead of your normal regimental flag. To my knowledge, the 28th Massachusetts would likely have still retained the first greens, as they called it, the first Irish Brigade flag, the iconic one with the Harp of Erin dead in the middle. The New York Battalion, they were centering upon the flag of the 88th New York, and they likely had their second greens with them. These were actually manufactured before the Battle of Fredericksburg, but they didn't get it until 1863, and they put the Harp of Erin in the corner, in the canton, and then the rest of the banner is actually have their battle honors of all the engagements they've been involved with. As for the 116th Pennsylvania, I've seen people report that they did not even carry the normal brigade banner. Rather, they were carrying the traditional Pennsylvania state regimental with them, in addition to the national colors. So very, very colorful display this small brigade's gonna make. And as they make their way through the Wheatfield, we mentioned about that brow that's protecting them. Well, you're gonna have no more protection. Here we are coming on top of the brow, and we're facing off towards Stony Hill, which is on the right flank of the Irish Brigade. And down over here, you're gonna see quite the scene. Over in this part of the field, on the south end of the field, you got some of G.T. Anderson's Georgians still defending along the stone wall, although Cross's brigade is trying to do a number on them. But the main focus of the Irish Brigade is going to be the two South Carolinian regiments holding Stony Hill, the 3rd and 7th South Carolina. These were part of Kershaw's brigade of South Carolinians. And when Kershaw's brigade touched off from Seminary Ridge to take part in this massive assault on the Union left flank on the evening of July 2nd, they had a little bit of problem deploying. They are missing one of their regiments when they first come out here to the Wheatfield. They are missing the 15th South Carolina. And the reason is, well, they got stuck behind some artillery pieces that were blocking their advance. And by the time the 15th South Carolina got to step off, the rest of Kershaw's brigade are too far ahead of them, so they attached themselves to another Georgian brigade, this one under the command of General Semmes. However, they're going to be quite a distance from supporting their own brigade, and as Kershaw's men approach the Wheatfield, they actually fragment. You're going to have the 3rd and 7th South Carolina come here to assist in the pressure being put on the Wheatfield, while most of Kershaw's brigade go toward the peach orchard, and their job is going to try to knock out the remaining artillery pieces that Sickles has deployed along the Wheatfield Road near the peach orchard, which, keep in mind, is the apex of the 3rd Corps' battle line for the Union Army. So we only got like a portion of Kershaw's brigade over here, and so far they're doing a pretty good job. They're maxed in on the rocky hill. They're able to put some heavy fire on the right flank of across this brigade. Remember, across the Union Army over here. Kershaw, the Confederates firing in, but that's all going to change when the Irish Brigade steps up onto this brow. They're going to see all the flashes of the muzzles coming from a fence line, particularly the 7th South Carolina are defending that fence line, and the whole of the Irish Brigade are going to center their attack right towards Stony Hill. And this is in the same time that Zulk's brigade is renewing their attack on Stony Hill against the 3rd South Carolina. So we go from the Confederates having the advantage in the Wheatfield. Very quickly, the power balance is about to change. This wayside, produced by the National Park Service, gives different maps of how the troops move through the Wheatfield throughout the evening of July 2nd. And you can kind of get an idea of why this is considered one of the most confusing parts of the Battle of Gettysburg. Troops are coming in from all directions on the Wheatfield. And keep in mind, we're really only focusing on one brigade doing one action in this 3-hour fight over this relatively non-consequential part of the battlefield. There is no tactical gain from having the Wheatfield. It's just the fact that Sickles' 3rd Corps' left flank will extend along the Wheatfield, and that's kind of what sets off the fighting over this spot. We're advancing in the southwest corner of the Wheatfield, and if we're here after 6 o'clock on July 2nd, 1863, the Irish Brigade are engaging the Confederates who are behind that fence line there, particularly Confederates of the 7th South Carolina Regiment. Now, the Irish Brigade are going to move very quickly through the Wheatfield. They do not want to be out in the open, and there is a bit of a mythology behind the firearms that the Irish Brigade carry. At the start of the Civil War, Thomas Francis Meagher issued to the initial units of the Irish Brigade the 1842 Springfield, which is a smooth-bore musket. They're not effective until you get very close. Now, if you're right upon the enemy, the 1842 Springfield actually fires a shot of buck and ball, which is murderous in close quarters. And it kind of motivated the Irish Brigade to always move quickly on the battlefield so they could get in close with the enemy to be within effective range. However, at Gettysburg, I should point out that the 28th Massachusetts, who did not join the brigade until after Antietam, well, they were issued Enfield rifles. And these guys actually had, these are rifled muskets, so these have far more accuracy, far more reach, far more efficiency than the iconic 42 Springfield the Irish Brigade are known for. And considering the fact the Irish Brigade is pretty small in size, 28th Massachusetts is the largest single regiment represented on this field for the Irish Brigade. So this idea that the Irish Brigade are at a complete disadvantage, well, it's technically true, since we're only down to about 500 men. And of those 500 men, 200 of them are equipped with Enfield rifles. They're going to be able to pack a bit more punch. In any case, the Irish Brigade have it instilled into them, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. They have it instilled in them to move rapidly on any battlefield, and they have been conditioned to do this over multiple years. So here they come over their brow, 7th South Carolina. They're going to see the emerald flags. They're going to know they're in for a heavy fight. The first volleys are fired by the 7th South Carolina. They're described as going over the heads of the Irish Brigade. The Irish Brigade reserve their fire until they get pretty close to the bottom of the brow here. And they're actually aiming at the feet. It seems they're aiming at the feet of the South Carolinians. And their volley is highly effective. The 7th South Carolina start falling back into the boulders. This is very heavily overgrown. During the battle would not have been this thick. There would have been trees up here, but you've been able to just move through the trees much easier. The Irish Brigade are going to press their advantage. The 116th Pennsylvania in particular are going to dash their way inside here. Mulholland is going to describe as he makes his way up Stony Hill, pushing the advance for the Irish Brigade. As they're coming through the boulders here, he finds at least 5 Confederate soldiers dead just behind one boulder, which to him proves the effectiveness of the Irish Brigade in the early moments of this fight. Now just to jump back a little bit to the fence line, the 7th South Carolina are behind at the base of Stony Hill. If we come across Aries Drive, you'll see the fence line continues. Over here, there is a gap in the tree line. There's a little bit of a ravine back here made by one of the tributaries of Plum Run. And well, the New York Battalion that's on the left flank of the Irish Brigade, they're going to notice that. And they're going to take advantage of it. Now, had the 15th South Carolina been able to advance with the rest of Kershaw's brigade, that gap may have been plugged up between Kershaw's brigade up here in Stony Hill and Anderson's brigade on the stone wall there on the south side of the Wheatfield. Well, they're not there around 6 p.m. on July 2nd, 1863. They're still trying to get their way around Semmes's brigade, come to the front to assist Kershaw. The New York regiments take advantage. They pour through this ravine, and they're going to come around the right flank of the 7th South Carolina, and are going to completely bewilder Kershaw's men who are on top of this hill. The Irish Brigade are going to push into the 7th South Carolina on their front, on their right flank. The 3rd South Carolina are going to give due to the 116th as well as Zook's brigade pushing in. It is going to be brief but close quarters combat here on Stony Hill, coming over the boulders. You can imagine men are probably tripping. I find accounts from the Irish Brigade, at least some of them with broken legs after this. You can only imagine it maybe have to do with coming through these thick boulders. The officers in many of the Irish Brigade regiments are drawing their sidearms, firing away into the South Carolina regiments. They drive the South Carolinians to the top and over Stony Hill. And in some accounts, there's a moment where both sides are so close to each other, they're at muzzle to muzzle with each other up here, that they stop firing. You know, smoke blows away around them, and they realize just how close they are. They're in murderous range. And then some of the officers in the Irish Brigade are going to start shouting for Confederates, drop your arms and go to the rear. And many of them are going to respond immediately, knowing that if they don't, they're most likely to be killed on this hilltop. In this intense fighting, the Irish Brigade are going to secure Stony Hill. They're going to move, continuing to the south over the ridge. They're going to come down to the southern slope facing toward the Rose Farm. So we're standing on the reverse slope of Stony Hill. And we kind of have a rough perspective that the Irish Brigade would have had once they secured this hilltop. They're looking to their south. They're going to see the Rose Farm. It's the stone farmhouse you see there in the distance. And it's roughly over there that Kershaw, General Kershaw, is trying to rally his men together. So you can imagine the 7th and 3rd South Carolinians, well, those are not now in the custody of Kelly and Zook's men. They're over there trying to rally in the farm field, but he knows it's not enough to hold back. He's trying to find where the 15th South Carolina is. He's also trying to reach out to find where General Semmes is. And I do see on some of the maps that you're going to see the 15th South Carolina and 50th Georgia. The South Carolinians being from Kershaw, the 50th being from Semmes, that they're going to try to come in and try to plug the gap that the New York Battalion had take advantage of. However, it's a little too late. And actually, as Semmes starts to get his Georgian brigade to reinforce Anderson's Georgians on the south end in the Wheatfield, Semmes is going to be mortally wounded. So on the south end of the Wheatfield, there's a brief lull in the Confederate action. The problem for the Irish Brigade is not this buildup of Confederate soldiers on the south, at least not yet. The Irish Brigade, after about a 15-minute excursion across the Wheatfield on top of Stony Hill, have secured it, have taken a couple hundred Confederates prisoner, and they've suffered some losses, but they're pretty proud of what they've gained here. Looks like to the front, the Confederates in a little bit of chaos. They got a lot of troops mounted on our south, but they're not really able to organize them immediately. Hey, Pomney, how's the right flank of us doing? They look to their west, and they're going to see some 1,300 Georgians coming over that crest where the peach orchard is. That was, I should say, the center of Dan Sickles' 3rd Union Corps, which had just been smashed by Barksdale's Mississippians, and now Wofford's Georgians are sweeping through what's left of the Peach Orchard and are coming toward us at an alarming rate toward the right flank of the Irish Brigade. And the 116th were on that right flank. And how do you think the 116th are feeling?
Not good.
They're not feeling good right now.
Really
they don't want to be
that.
here.
Yeah.
And Kelly is going to call a general retreat of the brigade, knowing that they're low on ammunition, their stamina has been worn out crossing the Wheatfield, and they want to secure the gains they've made today, those prisoners. So they're going to start bugging out of here. And the resulting retreat, Kelly's going to try to keep orderly, but it's going to start fraying as other Union brigades see what's coming for them and they start bumping into each other. As Woffin's Georgians are getting within range of Stony Hill, the Irish Brigade are going to fall back through the Wheatfield, coming right across the path they've just traversed, and chaos is going to erupt as the brigade's going to try their best. Kelly is going to try his best to keep the brigade in an orderly manner in a retreat. However, you're going to have other units from other brigades falling back through here trying to escape what's about to happen. They're bumping into each other. It's kind of like what happens when atoms bounce into each other. Bad things happen when that happens.
Bad things, yeah.
At least they didn't split the atom.
Yeah, it would have been bad.
That'd been even worse. That'd been even worse. In any case, there's going to be a number of chaotic scenes that the Irish Brigade witnesses as the brigade fragments on their retreat back towards Cemetery Ridge. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. As the Irish Brigade began to fall back, Lieutenant Charles Granger of the 88th New York is going to be bewildered by what he sees. As everybody's running for their lives, he comes across 2 soldiers from his brigade. One's from his own, the 88th New York, the other's from the 69th New York. And they're in the midst of a fist fight. What are they fighting over? Well, they're fighting over who gets the right to turn in a Confederate officer they had captured when they had taken Stony Hill. So as everybody's running for their lives, here Granger just pauses and just sees these 2 soldiers fighting it out, most likely to get captured themselves, but they really want that honor of taking in a Confederate officer as prisoner. So Granger, and as this is happening too, Granger claims that the Confederate officer is laughing hysterically to the point he's burst into tears, hands over his face because he can't believe what is happening. So Granger kind of steps in, intervenes, takes the Confederate officer and escorts him off the battlefield. Now, for the record, I found this in one book on the Irish Brigade here. I didn't really look through to see if how the documentation lines up. So this can all be hyperbolic and be completely made up in fantasy by Granger, but I think it explains the chaos that's happening when not just the Irish Brigade, but these Union brigades are coming into the Wheatfield and then immediately being pushed back. As the Irish Brigade fall back, Bernard O'Neill of the 69th New York is going to become separated from the rest of his regiment. And he's going to be going through the smoke here in the Wheatfield to try to find any trace of the 69th New York or the rest of the brigade, or really any Union soldiers for that matter, to rally around. Well, he's going to find 2 soldiers he claims are from his regiment, and in their possession is a small band of Confederate prisoners they had taken off Stony Hill. And Bernard decides to take charge of them, and they all go running off in the woods somewhere in the direction of Cemetery Ridge. Well, they're lost. They don't know where anybody is, because by this point, night is settling over the battlefield. So Bernard O'Neill makes a decision to bivouac and wait until morning before their advance. So here's O'Neill, has taken charge of these 2 soldiers of the I guess let's just say the Irish Brigade. So, and they're under the charge of all these Confederate prisoners, and they're there by a campfire. I'm imagining somebody has the prisoners at gunpoint. It's just an awkward situation, like, where are we at? Are we gonna make it through the night? Whose battle lines are we within? Early the next morning, July 3rd, Bernard O'Neill and his band of I guess you want to say their band of, what would you call them?
Stragglers?
Band of stragglers. Okay, that's a nicer term. They're going to make their way to the nearest base for the provost marshal for the Union Army. They're going to turn in the prisoners, and they're going to go back and and they ask, hey, where's the Irish Brigade, by the way? Well, they're directed back to Cemetery Ridge, and the Irish Brigade are actually encamped where they were at the start of July 2nd. So they had come back the way they came. Pretty easy. Bernard O'Neill is going to go and report to the field hospital for Caldwell's division to meet with the 69th New York's commander, who has actually been wounded in the fighting here in the Wheatfield. And the captain tells him, don't report to me. I'm not in charge now. Lieutenant Smith is now in charge of the 69th New York. So Bernard O'Neill's, probably sighs like, all right, I'll go back up there. Well, then the artillery bombardment at Pickett's charge starts, so he got to go take shelter, or else he's going to get hit by a fragment of artillery. So he is not able to get in contact with the Irish Brigade until July 4th, 1863. He reports to Colonel Kelly. Kelly directs him over to where the 69th is, and Bernard O'Neill, after 2 days being missing, reports in to Lieutenant Smith. Well, Lieutenant Smith's having none of it. He thinks that Bernard O'Neill deserted, or had gone, or at the very least had departed without proper leave. And he is going to have Bernard O'Neill court-martialed for his disappearance between July 2nd and 4th, 1863. Now, Bernard O'Neill and other people were able to collaborate enough evidence that he did not desert, they did not abandon his post, they had simply got lost in the chaos that had happened out here in the Wheatfield, and to be acquitted of all charges. Now, to give you a rough impact on how much the Irish Brigade had lost, because going into this battle, their numbers were already comparatively small, but that does mean one person is a major loss for the Irish Brigade, especially this far into the war where they've lost so much. And yes, I am going to use my notes. I apologize how unprofessional this is, as a bunch of rent-me cars drive past. Wow, look at them tiny cars. I don't know how I'd feel driving in one of those. You ever want to do one of those, or you think they're a little sketchy, or what do you think?
I prefer my full-size car, I think.
You prefer your full-size car? I like the air conditioning, personally.
Yeah.
So, according to my rough calculation, so this is all an approximate, the New York battalions had suffered a 30% casualty rate. The 116th Pennsylvania had suffered a 25% casualty rate. The 28th Massachusetts, which remember were in the center of the battle line for the Irish Brigade in the Wheatfield, they had suffered over a 40% casualty rate. In the aftermath of Gettysburg and the rest of the campaigns in 1863, which the Irish Brigade will participate in a very small number, Kelly is going to be allowed what Marr was not allowed to do, and that is go to New York and recruit reinforcements for the New York regiments. Mulholland's going to be allowed to go back to Pennsylvania, recruit reinforcements for the 116th Pennsylvania. So in 1864, the Irish Brigade is actually back to a much larger strength than they were here at Gettysburg. They're given some new wind by some reinforcements. They have about 1,000 soldiers in the brigade at the start of the Overland Campaign. And guess what? If you want to know more about the Overland Campaign, I got a whole month's worth of live streams talking about the complete chaos and destruction both the Army of North Virginia and Army of the Potomac suffer as Ulysses S. Grant comes to the Eastern Theater and drives the Union Army to the gates of Richmond. Though he's not successful in 1864 taking Richmond, he does succeed in bleeding the Army of North Virginia pretty thin, at the cost of bleeding his own army pretty thin. And while he'll be able to get reinforcements for other units and bring new units into the Army of Potomac, the Irish Brigade had lost all the gains they had made in the winter of 1863-64. They're back down to the meager, in fact, probably smaller to the size they were here at Gettysburg. And in the summer of 1864, the Irish Brigade will officially be disbanded, and the surviving regiments will be broken up amongst the 3rd and 4th Brigades of the Army of the Potomac. However, there is talk about them reforming a new Irish Brigade later in the year, that the Union government grants them the permission to outfit a new brigade with the survivors of the old regiment flags. And apparently they also throw in an artillery battery to reinforce them. Unfortunately, I do not have notes or information on this new Irish Brigade and what they do in the last days of the Civil War. So, hey, I know you armchair historians and you faithful supporters are out there watching. If you want to know in the comment section, what does the new Irish Brigade get up to in late 1864 and 1865? In June of 1865, the 116th Pennsylvania, the New York regiments, and the 28th Massachusetts will all be mustered out, as all other Union regiments are at the end of the American Civil War. The Irish Brigade go on to be one of the most heralded units for the Union Army during the American Civil War. They suffer one of the highest casualties in terms of brigade levels. I think only the Iron Brigade surpasses them in terms of losses per brigade. The first regimental monument for anybody in the Irish Brigade dedicated to Wheatfield was the 28th Massachusetts in 1885. And we got a marble eagle on top of a granite shaft. We'll come up here. Colonel Richard Barnes of Mars Irish Brigade, commanded by Colonel Patrick Kelly. They went into battle on July 2nd with 220 men. Remember, that would have been the largest single regiment in the Irish Brigade, 100 of whom were killed or wounded. This is erected by the survivors and friends of the regiment to mark the spot where it fought in defense of the American Union. In 1889, the monument to the 116th Pennsylvania was dedicated on top of Stony Hill. An interesting detail, it's the only monument to Gettysburg to depict a dead soldier. Now, there are several that depict a wounded soldier or somebody who's gravely wounded, and we can theorize will eventually die of their wounds, but to have somebody who's truly dead, this is the only monument, which is unique because in terms of the official statistics, the 116th only suffered 2 killed. They got off relatively easy in the fighting here on July 2nd. They suffered the lightest casualty rate amongst all of the Irish Brigade units. Why is there a dead soldier then on it? Well, as the 116th took this field, Mulholland is going to bear witness to a dead soldier of the 110th Pennsylvania who'd been fighting out here earlier in the day in the Wheatfield area. And the image was so vivid to him because he was shocked how young the soldier appeared and had died out here, looking no more than a mere boy in his teens. And that image always had haunted Mulholland and the men of the 116th. So when it came time to dedicate their monument here, they chose to, interestingly enough, have a depiction of a dead soldier from another Pennsylvania regiment on their own monument. For the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, a monument in honor of the 63rd, 69th, and 88th New York was erected upon Stony Hill. The memorial was created by William Rudolph O'Donovan, one of the leading American sculptors in the late 19th century. O'Donovan was a Civil War veteran who indeed was at Gettysburg, but not alongside the Irish Brigade. O'Donovan had operated an artillery piece for the Confederate Army during that fight. The fact that the man hired to produce this monument had fought against the Union was not common knowledge amongst the New York veterans until after the sculpture was finished. The monument is in fact dedicated to 4 different units. In addition to the Free Infantry regiments we've discussed, the 14th New York Independent Battery is also commemorated. These were in fact men who had enlisted with the Irish Brigade at the start of the war, but became detached to fill the demand for enlisted men amongst the Union's light artillery. Elements of the 14th did in fact serve at Gettysburg as part of Battery B, 1st New York Light Artillery. Beneath the Celtic cross rests what O'Donovan claimed to be a lifelike depiction of an Irish wolfhound. While a portion of the Irish Brigade did have animal mascots at one point or another, the wolfhound in the monument does not intentionally refer to them. Rather, O'Donovan's inclusion of the wolfhound may symbolize the devotion of the soldiers that was demonstrated on the battlefield. Personally, I see it as a more sobering reflection upon the losses the Irish Brigade suffered throughout the conflict, as O'Donovan makes a claim that the wolfhound was extinct. While this is largely true of the original breed, efforts to resurrect the breed in some domestic capacity have led to its rebirth here in the present day. Whether intentional or circumstantial, the story of loss and rebirth of the Irish wolfhound parallels the legacy of the Irish Brigade. While the ranks of its regiments were ravaged over the course of the American Civil War, a vestige has been carried on. The 69th New York continues to serve as a National Guard unit, known simply nowadays as the Fighting 69th. Its lineage has been carried through both world wars of the 20th century, as well as the Iraq War of the 21st century. Oh, you of a younger generation, think of what it cost our forefathers to save our glorious inheritance of union and liberty. If you let it slip from your hands, you will deserve to be branded as ungrateful cowards and undutiful sons. But no, you will not fail to cherish the prize. It is too sacred a trust, too dearly purchased. And that is why we do what we do here at Readout Productions and A Humble Collector. We try to preserve these events, the price of freedom that was paid by men in the Irish Brigade and in all wars in the United States America's history, or in any country you're from. If you have freedom in your country, it's important that we acknowledge the sacrifices ever paid to secure it. So thank you guys for watching this edition of Retracing History. We have been out here, I think it's the longest we've ever been on the battlefield. We've only been focusing on one unit. We've been out for well over 3 hours in one stint. So Our battlefield portion of our trip is over, but hey, you can go for our back catalog and you can see other videos of us exploring units that had marched out here and fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, like the 1st Minnesota, whose monument is right up there. And we walked right through this field last November to talk about their dramatic charge that led to an over 80% casualty rate, the highest casualty rate any regiment is going to suffer here at the Battle of Gettysburg. So definitely consider checking that out. Check all of our videos out. And if maybe the American Civil War or French and Indian War, which are my main 2 subjects I study, aren't of your interest, how about you head over to a Humble Collector's page? He focuses on preserving the history of both world wars. So be sure to head out to a Humble Collector's channel. Be sure to stick around here at Readout Productions for future videos. Thank you for watching. See you next time.